If we know physical activity, for example, can influence who is experiencing some form of cognitive deficit, or that physical activity, for example, might actually be helping in sparing brain tissue, then if we can identify people at risk early enough, perhaps we can do something about it before it's too late. And the reactionary approach oftentimes of our medical system is not well suited, at least not in terms of Alzheimer's disease. By the time many of those deficits show up, we have some wonderful pharmacotherapies that can buy you somewhere between 12 and 18 months at your current level of function, but it's a progressive disease. There is no cure, there's no stabilizing it, there's really no going back. But there may be delaying it, and that's going to be my last section that I really want to talk about. Here, I'll take a little poke at my father-in-law. I shouldn't do that, but I will anyways. And I'll just not show him this video after. The upshot of this is that whether we're talking about Alzheimer's disease or cancer or vascular diseases, you don't wake up one morning and have these things. And, for example, be disease-free a week ago or a month ago. The incubation period for many of these things is years. In fact, some of the best estimates now, I would say, in dementia or Alzheimer's disease in particular, is it may be 10 years, it may be 20 years. The changes that are underlying the deficits that are experienced in our 70s and our 80s and our 90s are manifest much, much earlier in life. And if we can identify those who are at risk, and we can identify the risk factors, maybe we can do something about that, at least in terms of delaying the disease. And so my father-in-law, getting back to him, always tells me, well, I've done this my whole life. It hasn't killed me yet. And I just mentioned to him, it will, in all likelihood. So it's never too late. As I argue with him, he needs to change a few lifestyle behaviors, as do we all. So to target effective intervention, what we need to know in the case of Alzheimer's disease now, how early declines really begin. And we also need to identify better tools, sensitive new indicators, and this is one of the things that Vinay Baradia was talking about in Café Scientifique last week, that will help us identify individuals. Some of the lab-based tasks that we're using at the university have been tried and true for many decades, but they're not necessarily the most sensitive to early deficit. They definitely help us with diagnosing whether or not somebody has a condition like Alzheimer's disease, but they won't necessarily tell us 10 years before if they're at risk for this. And so I want to talk to you about a class of early indicators that may serve that goal. So with regard to the early detection, there's been some interesting research of late. This is a study put out by my former postdoctoral mentor in Sweden, Lars Beckman, and science is advancing. You no longer conduct one study. This is now a study of studies. It's called a meta-analysis. And so you're actually broadly examining multiple different studies that have been done on this topic throughout the scientific literature. And the idea is strength in numbers, quite simply. If you have an effect that's replicated over many, many studies, then you have some strength or belief in terms of the findings that they're reported. And what this study of studies clearly said is that we can detect deficits, early deficits, for those in the prodromal phase of Alzheimer's disease, at least 5 years, 3 years for certain, but at least 5 years before you ever get diagnosed. There are already some cognitive changes, particularly in memory, going on during that time. And we've actually pushed the envelope here a little bit in this regard. This was a study that was published just last year where we were using some wonderful longitudinal data sets that tracked people's performance over the preceding 30, 35 years in some cases. These were wonderful participants making a great contribution to science. About every 2 or 3 years, they would put up with us. I'm using the royal we. I was only involved in the very tail end of those studies. But they would come back and they would go through the testing again and again. And it's wonderful because it really allows us to take a retrospective approach to see how early we can identify deficits in memory performance, for example. This, again, is a bit of a sloppy slide. There are multiple different types of cognitive function plotted here, but the one I want to draw your attention to is the red line here. This is memory performance. So if I read you a list of words, ask you to immediately recall them, these are the types of tasks that we're administering. And what we see is this line right here, this invisible line at the age of 85, this is the hypothetical point of diagnosis of Alzheimer's disease for this graph. And what we find is that people, in terms of their episodic memory performance, are showing declines up to 9 to 10 years prior to ever being diagnosed. And you can see here there's quite a difference. This sort of slow but steady decline I would call normative age-related change in memory function. Most will experience these subtle declines. They often don't even have a great impact on our everyday life. But somewhere about 9 or 10 years before, depending on your individual lifestyle and biological characteristics, you see this acceleration in cognitive change. And of course, the real trick here is that it's all well and good to have longitudinal data and to be able to go back in time and look at this. The litmus test here is to say, okay, well, what are you going to do about identifying my risk before I present that type of decline? And that's, of course, something that we're working on. Anyways, we've expanded this to about 10 years, and it really depends on a lot of your personal characteristics as well, as I had mentioned. So if we talk about physical activity, getting back to Art Kramer's work, save your memory, save your brain, right? People on the blue line here are individuals who aren't involved in any sort of physical activity whatsoever. And what you immediately notice is that they're performing worse than people in the green line here who have at least one or more physical activities that they're engaging in on a regular basis. So activity definitely makes a difference. People who are more active, not only are going to be healthier on balance, but they tend to have better memories. The other key thing, and this is even more important to me, I don't care if you perform twice as good as me on a memory test, I would rather, if I'm going to be subjected to this disease, show declines as late as humanly possible in life. And when my decline shows up, I'd be quite happy to show a more rapid drop rather than a slow but steady loss of function across many years. And that's what these moderating factors show. People who aren't active at all, this, again, this gray line shows a hypothetical diagnosis of Alzheimer's disease at age 85. And almost, again, 8 to 9 years before, the people who aren't active are starting to show signs of the first acceleration in cognitive impairment. The people who are active not only are performing better, but they save themselves about 4 years prior to them showing this acceleration in cognitive decline. I don't know about you, but in my world, 4 years is a lot of time, and I can think of a lot of things that I would like to be doing during that time. And if it's as easy as me becoming physically active, completely in my control, again, not sweating up a storm, as simple as walking regularly with family, with friends, that can have a big impact, and you can absolutely sign me up. Okay, in terms of these types of procedures then that we're going to bring to bear on detecting who's at risk as early as we possibly can, our working assumption for this PREVENT study is that biological compromise, changes in the brain, for example, are going to be manifest earlier than changes in your memory performance or any sort of behavior that we can measure. It's quite likely that biological changes are going on, a certain number of those changes accrue, and at some point you hit this threshold where your function starts becoming affected. You've got a certain amount of biological insult, and finally that has an impact on your memory. So one of the first things that we're using in our lab are brain imaging techniques. And on the left-hand side here, this is a magnetic resonance imaging scanner. Some people would call it an invasive technique. It's kind of cold in there. It's pretty loud. But if you've experienced an MR scan for health reasons, or you've participated in a memory project, it really is an invaluable tool. You're performing a cognitive task, but you're doing it inside this giant magnet that's basically allowing us to take pictures of your brain in terms of how it looks, its structure, as well as in terms of its function. And in my shared lab in the psychology department with Drs. Andrea Pitchen and Dr. Scott Hofer, we obtained a grant to purchase another brain imaging infrastructure called near-infrared spectroscopy. I don't know if Paul's in the room, but you can see by his complexion here, he's somewhat embarrassed to be modeling this for you. It's not the most becoming of apparatus, but it actually helps us image your brain as well, and we can do that right on campus. We don't have to go to the hospital to do that. And I have colleagues in Norway, for example, as part of their lab, they have this wonderful t-shirt with a picture of the brain and some functional activation on it. And the caption below it says something to the effect of, "Welcome to the Bergen Neuroimaging Laboratory," quotes, "where we can see what you are thinking." It's not that simple, so don't get a complex over it. But the upside is that with these types of tools, even if an individual is not showing a behavioral deficit, there's lots of studies to show that there are systematic changes going on in the brain prior to those declines rearing their ugly head. So what we're doing in the PREVENT study is we're trying to combine a lot of these techniques that heretofore have been studied in isolation. So brain imaging is one of them. This is actually a histopathological slide. These individuals were deceased and they had donated their brains, but the structural images that we get from an MR scanner are pretty impressive as well. They allow us to take measurements, and on that basis we can look at specific regions in the brain. This is a region called the medial temporal lobe, which in a healthy person, you can see the tissue looks dense. It looks great. I wish mine looked like that. And on the right-hand side, this is an individual who suffered from Alzheimer's disease. And when you compare the two images, you can clearly see there are huge differences. The disease takes quite a toll. And as it turns out, this specific region of the brain is linked to memory function. And it's one of the earliest regions to show changes in Alzheimer's disease, linked to memory deficit as well. Another thing that we purchased for our laboratory recently, you guys would look at this and you see this mat here down the hallway with these detectors, and there's actually thousands and thousands of embedded sensors in this. This would be tantamount to the world's most expensive hallway runner, I would say. Probably not one that you'll want to purchase for your home, but we love it because you can walk back and forth on this mat, and characteristics of your walking or your gait can be critically important early indicators of changes in your central nervous system, particularly in terms of your brain. And Janet Love, amongst other graduate students in my lab, has been using this and collecting a lot of data in an ongoing study right now as well. And so we look at various things. We look at how fast you walk. We look at how wide your stepping is. We look at how long your stepping is, and so on. And I don't have the time here to get into why those sorts of things are important, but I can say this: simply walking back and forth on this apparatus has been linked to changes in brain structure and function. It's been linked to cognitive impairment. It's been linked to falls, which is a critical issue, certainly within healthcare and for each of us. A broken hip is not a pleasant experience. And it's even related to mortality.